The queen laughed when the servant opened the holy book. The king stopped smiling. After the second verse, the morning sun cast long shadows through the stained glass windows of Ravenhall's great cathedral, painting the stone floor in fractals of crimson and gold. Sister Margaret, a woman of perhaps 40 winters with calloused hands and eyes that held more wisdom than her station suggested, moved through the empty nave with practiced silence. Her rough-spun habit whispered against the floor as she arranged the sacred texts for the day's ceremonies. She had served in this cathedral for 20 years, though few knew her story before that. The other sisters whispered sometimes about the scars on her hands, not the marks of kitchen work or garden toil, but something else, something that spoke of a different life entirely. Margaret paid their whispers no mind. She had found peace in service, in the simple rhythm of prayer and duty. King Roderick entered the cathedral that morning with his usual retinue, his boots echoing against the ancient stones with the confidence of a man who believed God himself had ordained his rule. Beside him walked Queen Isabel, resplendent in emerald silk that caught the light like scales of some mythical serpent. Her laugh rang out at something one of her ladies had whispered, the sound sharp and bright as breaking glass. "Your Majesty," Father Benedict bowed low, his considerable girth making the gesture somewhat ungainly. "We are honored by your presence for morning prayers." The king waved a dismissive hand. "Let us proceed quickly, Father. We have matters of state to attend." His eyes swept the cathedral with the casual disinterest of familiarity, passing over Sister Margaret as she stood by the altar without truly seeing her. Queen Isabel's gaze, however, lingered on the servant sister with something approaching amusement. "Is this the one who claims to read?" she asked Father Benedict, her voice carrying that particular tone of condescension wrapped in false interest. "How unusual for one of her station." Margaret kept her eyes downcast, her hands folded within her sleeves. She had learned long ago that invisibility was often the greatest protection. "Sister Margaret assists with the texts, Your Majesty," Father Benedict explained, a slight nervousness creeping into his voice. "She has proven quite capable in her duties." "Capable," the Queen repeated, tasting the word as if it were foreign wine. "How delightful! Perhaps she might demonstrate this capability for us." She turned to her husband with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Wouldn't that be entertaining, my lord? To hear the holy word from such humble lips?" King Roderick was already settling into the ornate chair reserved for royalty, his attention half on the conversation and half on Lord Chancellor Blackwood, who had begun whispering urgently about grain shipments. "Whatever amuses you, my dear," he said absently. Margaret felt the weight of their expectations, the cruel edge beneath the Queen's request. She had seen this game played before, the powerful amusing themselves with the fumbling attempts of their lessers. Many of the servants couldn't read at all, and those who could managed only the simplest texts. It was a source of constant entertainment for the nobility to watch them struggle over the elaborate Latin of the holy books. "Sister Margaret," Father Benedict said, his voice carrying a note of warning, "perhaps you might read from the Book of Common Prayers." But the Queen's hand shot up. "No, no, Father. Let her choose. Surely someone so capable knows which words the Lord would have us hear today." The mockery in her voice was unmistakable now, and several of the courtiers began to smirk in anticipation of the coming humiliation. Margaret moved to the lectern with measured steps, her fingers trailing along the spines of the sacred texts. She could feel their eyes upon her, predatory, eager for her failure. Her hand paused on a particular volume, one that was rarely opened, its leather binding cracked with age and neglect. The Book of Sacred Prophecies and Judgments. Most avoided it, finding its words too complex, its messages too dire for comfortable morning prayers. She opened it with steady hands, and the Queen actually laughed aloud. "Oh, how ambitious! She's chosen the most difficult text in the cathedral. This should be quite the performance." Margaret's eyes found the passage she sought, words she had read countless times in the deep of night when sleep eluded her, when memories of another life pressed close. She began to read, and her voice, when it came, was not the halting whisper they expected. "Hear then the word of the Lord, ye who sit in judgment over his people," she began, her voice carrying with unexpected clarity through the vast space, "who clothe themselves in purple and gold, while the righteous shiver in rags." The Queen's laughter faltered slightly. King Roderick looked up from his conversation with Blackwood, a frown creasing his brow. This was not the stumbling performance they had anticipated. Margaret continued, her voice gaining strength, the Latin flowing from her lips with the fluency of deep education. "Woe unto those who feast while others starve, who build their palaces upon the bones of the innocent. For the Lord sees all, and his judgment comes like a thief in the night." "Enough," the king said, but his voice lacked its usual authority. There was something unsettling about the way this simple servant read, not just the fluency, but the conviction, as if she understood every word at a level beyond mere comprehension. But Margaret did not stop. She turned the page with deliberate slowness, her eyes never leaving the text. "And the Lord spoke unto Samuel, saying, I have seen the suffering of my people, the tears of widows and orphans. I have heard the cries of those wrongly accused, those cast down by false witness." Queen Isabel had gone very pale. Her hand reached for her husband's arm, fingernails digging into the rich fabric of his sleeve. "Make her stop," she hissed, but her voice carried in the cathedral's acoustics. Margaret's voice rose, filling the sacred space with words that seemed to echo from the very stones. "Therefore thus saith the Lord, I shall raise up the lowly and cast down the mighty. Those who have sown injustice shall reap the whirlwind. The blood of the innocent cries out from the ground, and I have heard their plea." Lord Chancellor Blackwood shifted uncomfortably. These words, they struck too close to recent events. The trials of the previous year, the executions that had followed. The Queen had been instrumental in those proceedings, her testimony condemning many to the flames. "You dare!" King Roderick began, rising from his chair, but Margaret finally looked up from the book, and something in her eyes made him pause. They were not the eyes of a servant. They held depths he had not expected, pain and knowledge in equal measure. "I dare only to read the words written here, Your Majesty," she said quietly. "Words inspired by the divine, meant for all who have ears to hear." She returned to the text, her voice now carrying an almost hypnotic quality. "For the Lord remembers all things, and in his time all secrets shall be revealed. The mighty shall answer for their crimes, and those they have wronged shall be their accusers." The cathedral had fallen utterly silent. Even the ever-present whisper of wind through the stone corridors seemed to have stilled. Father Benedict stood frozen, his face a mask of terror and something else, recognition perhaps, or long-buried memory stirring to life. Margaret turned another page, and her voice took on a different quality, deeper, more resonant. "Hear now the prophecy given unto Jeremiah in the days of tribulation. A servant shall stand before kings and speak truth to power. The meek shall open the book of judgment, and the proud shall tremble at her words." "Her words," Queen Isabel repeated faintly. She was gripping her husband's arm so tightly now that her knuckles had gone white. "And in that day," Margaret continued, "the Lord shall restore what was stolen, shall vindicate the falsely accused. Those who bore false witness shall be consumed by their own lies, and justice shall flow like a mighty river." She closed the book with a sound that echoed like thunder in the stillness. For a long moment, no one moved. Then the king found his voice, though it emerged rougher than usual. Where did you learn to read Latin like that?" Margaret's hands rested on the closed book, and for the first time she met his gaze directly. "Your Majesty asks where I learned, but perhaps the better question is where I first taught." Father Benedict made a strangled sound. His eyes had gone wide with sudden understanding. "No," he breathed, "it cannot be. Lady Catherine died. She was executed for heresy," Margaret finished calmly, "or so it was claimed, though the witnesses who testified to my supposed crimes seemed remarkably well compensated afterward. Didn't they, Your Majesty?" The Queen swayed on her feet, and only her husband's arm kept her upright. "Lady Catherine Montrose, scholar, theologian, advisor to the previous king. She had been too influential, too intelligent, too dangerous to those who sought to manipulate the young Prince Roderick when he ascended to the throne. The trial had been swift, the evidence damning, and the execution, except there had been whispers that the woman who burned had not been Lady Catherine at all, but another who had taken her place, allowing the true lady to escape. "You're dead," Queen Isabel whispered. "I saw you burn. I testified against you myself. You corrupted the late king with your influence, sought to control the throne through false prophecies and heretical teachings." Margaret Catherine smiled then, and it was neither kind nor cruel, simply sad. "You testified to many things, Your Majesty. That I practiced dark arts, that I conspired with enemies of the crown, that I had bewitched the late king into naming me his advisor. All lies, as you well knew. You needed me gone to secure your own position beside the then prince." "Guards!" the king bellowed, but his voice cracked on the word. "Caesar!" The guards moved forward uncertainly, but Margaret raised her hand, and they paused. There was something in her bearing now, a nobility that her rough habit could not disguise. "Would you compound one injustice with another, Your Majesty? I have broken no law. I have merely read from Holy Scripture in a house of God. You are Lady Catherine Montrose, condemned traitor and heretic," Lord Blackwood said, though he took a step backward as he spoke. "Your very presence here is a crime." "Lady Catherine Montrose is dead," she replied simply. "You all saw to that. I am Sister Margaret, a humble servant of God who has spent 20 years in penance and prayer." She looked at the Queen, who had gone the colour of old parchment. "Tell me, Your Majesty, do you still have nightmares? Do you still see the faces of those your false testimony condemned?" "Lies," Isabel gasped, but her denial lacked conviction. "Everything you say is lies." Margaret walked slowly to a particular stone in the cathedral floor, one worn smooth by centuries of footsteps. She knelt and pressed a sequence of stones in a pattern that seemed random, but was anything but. There was a grinding sound, and a section of the floor shifted, revealing a hidden compartment. From within, she withdrew a leather portfolio bound with ribbon that had once been purple, but had faded to grey with age. "Your late father knew the value of insurance, Your Majesty," she said to the king. "He was a wise man, if not always a kind one. He suspected that his son might one day be vulnerable to manipulation, so he took precautions. Documents, letters, confessions." She opened the portfolio and withdrew a sheet of vellum covered in elegant script. "Shall I read this one? It's quite illuminating. A letter from your dear Queen to Lord Blackwood, dated 1 week before my trial, discussing how to dispose of the Montrose problem and ensure the appropriate witnesses were prepared." Blackwood lunged for the document, but Margaret stepped back with surprising agility. "Or perhaps this one." She held up another paper. "A receipt for 30 pieces of silver paid to one Marcus the Miller for testimony against Lady Catherine Montrose. Interesting how he came into such wealth just days after the trial, isn't it? Enough to buy that grand mill he'd always coveted." "Those documents prove nothing," the Queen said, but her voice had gone shrill. "They could be forgeries created by a dead woman?" Margaret asked mildly. "How inconvenient for you that I survived, though I suppose I should thank you in a way. 20 years of contemplation and service have taught me things I never would have learned in the comfort of court." She turned to address the growing crowd of courtiers and servants who had gathered, drawn by the commotion. "I learned what it means to truly serve, to scrub floors and tend the sick, to comfort the dying with no thought of reward, to be invisible and yet see everything." She pulled out more documents, handling them with the reverence one might show for holy relics. "I've watched you, Your Majesties, watched as you taxed the people into starvation to fund your wars, watched as you sold positions of justice to the highest bidder, watched as you perverted the very laws meant to protect the innocent." Her voice never rose above conversational level, but it carried to every corner of the cathedral. "And I've documented it all." King Roderick's hand went to his sword, But Father Benedict stepped forward. "Your Majesty, we are in a house of God. To spill blood here would be sacrilege. She is a condemned criminal," the king snarled, but uncertainty had crept into his voice. The documents in Margaret's hands could not be so easily dismissed. His father had indeed been secretive in his final years, had indeed spoken of insurance and protection, and the seal on those papers, he recognized it. It was authentic. Margaret continued to remove papers from the portfolio, laying them out on the altar with methodical precision. "A letter from your Majesty ordering the imprisonment of Lord Fairfax's daughter, unless he voted for the new tax. The girl was 7 years old, I believe. And here, correspondence discussing the removal of Bishop Thomas when he refused to support your war against Westmarch. He died quite suddenly of a mysterious illness, didn't he?" The crowd was murmuring now, a low, dangerous sound like distant thunder. Many of them had suffered under the current reign, had lost loved ones to suspicious circumstances or unjust laws. They pressed closer, eager to hear more. "You think you can destroy us with old papers?" Queen Isabel had found her voice again, and with it, her venom. "You are one woman alone, with no allies and no power. We are the crown." Margaret smiled then, and it was the smile of someone who had waited 2 decades for this moment. "Alone? No, Your Majesty. I've spent 20 years among the common people, the servants, the forgotten ones. Do you think I've been idle? Do you think I haven't shared what I know with those who have ears to hear?" As if on cue, the cathedral doors opened, and more people began to file in. Not nobles or courtiers, but common folk, merchants, craftsmen, farmers. Each carried a candle, and as they entered, the cathedral began to glow with their combined light. "What is this?" the king demanded. "What have you done?" "I've given them the truth," Margaret replied simply. "Every document I've collected, every crime I've witnessed, every injustice you've perpetrated, copies have been made and distributed. The monastery at Thornfield has a complete set. So does the Abbey of St. Clara. The Archbishop in the capital has been particularly interested in the evidence of your interference in church elections." Lord Blackwood had gone as grey as his name. "You couldn't have. The logistics alone. 20 years is a long time, Lord Chancellor, long enough to build a network, long enough to earn trust, long enough to prepare." She picked up another document. "This one is my favorite. Your own confession, written in your hand, sealed with your ring. You were quite drunk that night 5 years ago, do you remember? You boasted to what you thought was a simple serving woman about how cleverly you had orchestrated my downfall. How you had convinced the Queen that I was a threat to her future power. How you had planted the evidence of heresy in my chambers." Blackwood's mouth opened and closed soundlessly, like a fish gasping for air. The crowd had grown larger now, filling the cathedral to capacity. Among them, Margaret recognized faces, people she had helped over the years, families of those who had suffered under the current regime. They stood silent, waiting, their candles creating a sea of light that seemed to push back against the shadows where the nobles huddled. "This is rebellion," the king said, but his voice had lost its commanding tone. "It's treason." "Is it treason to speak truth, Your Majesty?" Margaret asked. "Is it rebellion to seek justice? I have not called for violence. I have not raised armies. I have simply revealed what was hidden, brought light to darkness." She gestured to the crowd. "These people have not come here to overthrow you. They have come to bear witness." Sister Agnes, elderly and bent with age, stepped forward from the crowd. "She saved my grandson," she said, her voice thin but clear. "When the royal tax collectors took everything, when we had no food, no medicine, Sister Margaret brought both, asked for nothing in return." A blacksmith followed, his massive arms crossed over his chest. "She taught my daughter to read when the law said commoners shouldn't learn. Now my girl keeps the accounts for half the merchants in the lower quarter." One by one they spoke. Testimonies not of Margaret's supposed crimes, but of her kindness, her wisdom, her quiet work among them for 2 decades. With each story, the king and queen seemed to shrink, their royal presence diminishing in the face of such unified witness. Margaret raised her hand, and the testimonies ceased. "Your Majesties have a choice," she said. "You can attempt to silence me again, though I think you'll find that more difficult this time. You can try to suppress the documents, though copies exist in places beyond your reach. You can continue to rule through fear and lies, though the people now know the truth." She paused, letting the weight of her words settle. "Or you can confess, publicly, fully. You can make restitution to those you've wronged. You can step down from the throne you obtained through deception and murder." "Never!" Queen Isabel spat. "We are divinely appointed. Her words were cut short as the cathedral bells began to toll. Not the regular marking of the hour, but the pattern reserved for momentous occasions, deaths of kings, declarations of war, or the arrival of high church authority. The great doors opened once more, and Archbishop Cornelius entered, flanked by a contingent of church guards. He was an imposing figure despite his advanced age, his white robes pristine, his staff of office gleaming in the candlelight. Behind him walked several other bishops, their faces grave. "Your Eminence," Father Benedict stammered, dropping to his knees, "we were not expecting—" "I received some rather disturbing documents," the Archbishop said, his voice carrying the authority of his office. "Documents that, if authentic, suggest grave sins have been committed. Sins against God's law and man's." His gaze moved to Margaret, and something shifted in his expression. "Lady Catherine, I heard rumors of your survival, but I scarce believed them." Margaret inclined her head respectfully. "Your Eminence, I go by Sister Margaret now. Lady Catherine died 20 years ago, as the official records state." "Indeed." The Archbishop's gaze moved to the King and Queen. "Your Majesties, these allegations require investigation. The Church must determine the truth of these matters." "The Church has no authority over the Crown," King Roderick declared, his hand again moving to his sword. "In matters of heresy, false witness, and murder, the Church has every authority," the Archbishop replied calmly. "You would do well to remember that your crown was placed upon your head by holy hands. What the Church grants, it can also revoke." The Queen laughed then, a sound devoid of humor, sharp and bitter. "You would believe the word of a servant over your rightful rulers. I would believe evidence over assertions, Your Majesty." The Archbishop held up a sheaf of papers, "and the evidence is quite compelling. Moreover, there is the matter of Sister Margaret herself. If she is indeed Lady Catherine Montrose, then her execution was clearly falsified. That raises questions about the legitimacy of the trial itself." Margaret stepped forward, removing her rough servant's cowl. Beneath it, her hair was silver now where it had once been dark, and lines marked her face where youth had once resided. But there was no mistaking the distinctive cheekbones, the unusual amber eyes that had once advised a king. "I stand ready to answer any questions the Church may have," she said. "I have nothing to hide. Can their Majesties say the same?" The crowd stirred, their murmuring growing louder. The guards looked uncertain, their loyalty wavering between their sovereigns and the mounting evidence of their crimes. Lord Blackwood had edged toward the door, but found his way blocked by common folk who stood firm, their candles raised like weapons of light. "Your Eminence," Margaret continued, "I request sanctuary within the Church while these matters are investigated. I have lived as a servant of God these 20 years, and I place myself under holy protection." Granted," the Archbishop said immediately. "Any who would harm Sister Margaret now would face excommunication." The King's face had gone purple with rage. "You dare!" But his words were interrupted by a new voice from the crowd. "Father!" Prince William pushed through the throng, his young face flushed with exertion. He was barely 18, recently returned from his studies abroad. "Father, what is happening? I heard the bells, the rumors in the street." He stopped short as he saw Margaret. "Lady Catherine, but you died when I was an infant. Mother said—" His gaze swung to Queen Isabel, and understanding began to dawn in his eyes. "Mother, what did you say?" "Your mother said many things," Margaret replied gently. "Not all of them were true. The prince looked at the documents spread across the altar, at the crowd of witnesses, at the archbishop's grave face. "Is it true?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "The things they're saying in the streets, that you condemned innocent people, that you bought the throne with blood." "Your son deserves the truth," Margaret said to the king and queen. "He will inherit whatever kingdom remains after this day. Should he not know what foundation it rests upon?" Queen Isabel reached for her son, but he stepped back. "William, my darling, you don't understand. We did what was necessary to protect the kingdom, to protect you, by murdering innocent people." The prince's voice cracked. "By bearing false witness. These are sins against God and man, mother." Margaret watched the young prince with something like sympathy. "You have a choice, Your Highness," she said softly. "You can stand with your parents in their deception, or you can choose a different path. The throne will need someone to occupy it when this is over. The question is whether you will be a king of truth or lies." The prince stood frozen for a long moment, torn between loyalty to his family and the growing horror of their crimes. Then slowly he walked to the altar and picked up one of the documents. His face paled as he read, his hands beginning to shake. "This is your seal, father," he said, holding up the paper. "Your hand. These orders. Children imprisoned, families destroyed, all for political gain." He set down the paper with trembling fingers. "How could you? Everything we did was for the kingdom," King Roderick roared. "For stability, for strength. That woman," he pointed at Margaret, "would have filled your grandfather's head with notions of reform, of sharing power with the common folk. She would have destroyed everything." "And so you destroyed her instead," Prince William said quietly. "Or tried to." He turned to Margaret. "Lady Catherine, Sister Margaret, forgive me for the sins of my family. I knew nothing of this, but ignorance is no excuse." "You were a child," Margaret replied. "The sins of the fathers need not fall upon the sons, if the sons choose righteousness." The archbishop stepped forward, his staff striking the floor with decisive authority. "King Roderick, Queen Isabel, Lord Chancellor Blackwood, you stand accused of bearing false witness, conspiracy to commit murder, corruption of justice, and crimes against God's law. You will submit to ecclesiastical trial." "I submit to nothing," the king snarled, finally drawing his sword. "I am king by right of blood and conquest." "You are king by right of lies and murder," Margaret said calmly, "and that right ends today." The king lunged at her, his blade singing through the air. But 20 years of hard labor had not made Margaret weak. It had made her strong in ways the pampered king could never match. She sidestepped his attack with surprising grace, and his momentum carried him forward, stumbling into the altar. The documents scattered, floating through the air like falling leaves, each one a testament to crimes and cruelties. The royal guards moved then, but not toward Margaret. They formed a protective circle around her, their captain stepping forward. "Your Majesty," he said formally, "please surrender your weapon. We cannot allow violence in this holy place." "You dare betray your king?" Roderick gasped, struggling to his feet. "We serve the rightful law, Your Majesty," the captain replied. "And the law, it seems, has been perverted for too long." Queen Isabel had sunk to her knees, her perfect composure finally shattered. Tears streaked her carefully painted face as the weight of exposure crushed down upon her. "It wasn't supposed to happen like this," she whispered. "We were supposed to rule forever. Our line was supposed to be eternal." "Nothing built on lies can last forever, Your Majesty," Margaret said, not unkindly. "I learned that lesson well. Perhaps now you will too." Lord Blackwood made one last attempt to flee, but the crowd would not let him pass. They didn't attack him. Margaret had clearly counseled against violence, but they stood firm, an immovable wall of humanity that had finally found its voice. "Your Eminence," Prince William said, his voice steady despite his youth, "I request that you oversee a formal investigation into all aspects of my parents' reign. Let every crime be brought to light, every victim be heard, every injustice be acknowledged." The archbishop nodded solemnly. You show wisdom beyond your years, Your Highness. The Church will ensure that justice is served, tempered with mercy where appropriate. Mercy, King Roderick spat. For her, she destroyed everything. No, Your Majesty, Margaret said quietly. You destroyed everything the moment you chose ambition over truth, power over justice. I merely survived to bear witness. She turned to address the crowd, her voice carrying to every corner of the cathedral. Let it be known that vengeance was never my goal. I sought only truth and justice. The guilty will face judgment, but there will be no mob violence, no blood in the streets. We are better than that. We must be better than that. The crowd murmured its agreement, the tension that had been building slowly dissipating. These were people who had suffered, but they were also people who had been helped by the quiet servant who had moved among them for 20 years, teaching their children, tending their sick, sharing what little she had. As the guards led the king and queen away, Isabel turned back one last time. "Why?" she asked Margaret. "Why didn't you just disappear? Why come back?" Margaret considered the question, then answered with simple honesty. Because injustice thrives in silence, because the innocent needed a voice, because 20 years ago I was too proud to see the suffering of others. I thought my learning and position made me superior. But living among the common people, serving them, being one of them, it taught me that true nobility has nothing to do with blood or titles. It comes from service, from sacrifice, from choosing to stand for what is right, even when it costs everything. The Queen had no response to that. She allowed herself to be led away, her head bowed, her crown sitting crooked on her dishevelled hair, a symbol of power that had already begun to lose its meaning. Prince William approached Margaret, uncertainty written across his young features. "What happens now? I'm the heir, but I'm not ready to rule. I don't know how to be king, especially after this." Margaret studied him for a long moment, then smiled, the first genuine smile she had offered in the entire confrontation. "Your grandfather once told me that the best kings are those who don't want the crown, but accept it as a duty. You have good instincts, Your Highness. Trust them. Will you help me?" he asked. "Will you be my advisor, as you were my grandfather's?" Margaret shook her head gently. "Lady Catherine Montrose is dead, remember? And Sister Margaret has found her calling in simpler service. But there are others, good people who have been overlooked, dismissed, or silenced. Listen to them, learn from them, build your counsel not from those who seek power, but from those who seek justice." She moved through the crowd then, stopping to embrace those she had come to know over her years of service. Old Tom the baker, whose son she had taught to read. Widow Morris, whose fever she had nursed through long winter nights. Young Sarah, who now served as a scribe thanks to Margaret's secret lessons. Each face told a story, each story a thread in the tapestry she had woven over 2 decades of patient work. Father Benedict approached her hesitantly. "Sister Margaret, Lady Catherine, I don't know what to call you. I believed the lies. When you first came here, I thought you were just another desperate soul seeking sanctuary. I never imagined. You gave me shelter when I needed it most," Margaret replied. "You allowed me to serve, to find purpose in my exile. That is more than I had any right to expect." The Archbishop joined them, his austere expression softening slightly. "You know, I always suspected the trial was false. Your supposed crimes never aligned with the woman I knew, but I was young then, newly appointed, afraid to challenge the crown. We all have our regrets, Your Eminence. The question is what we do with them." As the day wore on, more revelations emerged. The documents Margaret had preserved revealed a web of corruption that extended far beyond the king and queen. Noble families who had participated in the conspiracy were exposed. Judges who had perverted justice for gold faced their own reckoning. It was, as one chronicler would later write, the great cleansing of the kingdom. But Margaret took no joy in the downfall of the mighty. In the quiet moments between the chaos, she could be found in the cathedral's small chapel, praying, not for vengeance or even for justice, but for wisdom, for mercy, for the kingdom to heal from wounds that ran deeper than most realized. Prince William sought her out there as sunset painted the chapel in shades of gold and scarlet. "They're calling for executions," he said quietly. "The people want blood for blood." "And what do you want?" Margaret asked. The prince was quiet for a long moment. "I want to be different from my parents. I want to be better, but I also want them to face consequences for what they've done." "Then find a middle path," Margaret suggested. "Exile rather than execution. Restitution rather than retribution. Strip them of their wealth and power. Use it to rebuild what they destroyed. Let them live with the knowledge of what they've lost and why. The people might not accept that. They've suffered greatly. Then remind them that mercy is not weakness, but strength, that breaking the cycle of violence is the only way to truly move forward." She turned to face him fully. "You have a chance to set a new precedent, Your Highness. To show that justice doesn't require cruelty." The prince nodded slowly, the weight of decision visible on his young shoulders. "Will you at least stay until the trials are concluded? Your testimony will be crucial." "I will stay as long as I'm needed," Margaret agreed. "But when this is finished, I intend to return to my simple life. There is still much work to do among the people, and I've found more satisfaction in teaching a child to read than I ever did in advising kings." Over the following weeks, the trials proceeded. The Archbishop, true to his word, ensured they were fair but thorough. Margaret testified, her memory clear and her documentation irrefutable. The King and Queen were found guilty on all charges, as was Lord Blackwood and several other conspirators. But when the time came for sentencing, Prince William stood before the court and argued for mercy. Exile, not execution. Restitution, not retribution. The crowd was initially hostile to the idea, but Margaret spoke in support of the prince's decision, and her words carried weight with those who had come to trust her over the years. "We have a choice," she told the assembled masses. "We can repeat the mistakes of the past, creating new martyrs and new grudges, or we can choose a different path. Let the guilty live with their shame. Let them see the kingdom prosper without them. Let their punishment be the knowledge that their names will forever be associated with corruption and cruelty, while those they wronged are remembered for their courage and dignity." It was not a popular decision, but it was accepted. The former king and queen were stripped of all titles and possessions, given simple clothes and a small purse of copper coins, and sent into exile. They were forbidden from ever returning to the kingdom on pain of death. Lord Blackwood and the other conspirators received similar sentences. As the royal couple was led to the border, Isabel turned back one last time. She looked older, diminished, the proud queen reduced to a common exile. "I still don't understand," she called to Margaret. "You won. Why show mercy?" Margaret walked closer, her voice gentle but firm. "Because mercy is what separates justice from vengeance. Because you showed me none, and I refuse to become you. Because somewhere, perhaps, in your exile, you might find the redemption that was denied to me for 20 years. I found mine in service. Perhaps you'll find yours in suffering, or perhaps not, but at least you'll have the chance." The former queen had no response. She turned away, following her husband into the unknown, their figures growing smaller against the horizon until they disappeared entirely. The coronation of King William IV was a modest affair by royal standards. He insisted on a simple ceremony. The funds that would have been spent on elaborate celebrations redirected to rebuilding efforts in the poorest districts of the kingdom. Margaret attended, standing not with the nobles, but among the common folk she had served for so long. When the crown was placed upon his head, William's first act as king was to establish the Council of Common Voices, positions in his government reserved for representatives chosen by the people themselves. It was a radical change, one that the remaining nobility opposed but could not prevent. "You're revolutionizing the kingdom," Margaret told him after the ceremony. "I'm trying to heal it," William corrected, "and I'm following the example of a woman who spent 20 years showing that true power comes from service, not domination." As the seasons turned, Margaret found herself increasingly able to return to the life she had built as Sister Margaret. She continued to teach, to heal, to serve. But now she did so openly, no longer hiding her education or abilities. The cathedral's small school grew into a proper academy, welcoming students regardless of their birth or station. One evening, nearly a year after the trials, Margaret was teaching a group of young students when a familiar figure appeared in the doorway. Prince William, King William now, stood there in simple clothes, without crown or regalia. "Your Majesty," she said, starting to rise, but he waved her down. "Please, continue. I came to observe, not interrupt." She returned to her lesson, teaching the children about the importance of truth in historical records, about how power unchecked could corrupt even the best intentions. The king listened quietly, and when the lesson ended and the children dispersed, he approached. "I've received word from the borderlands," he said quietly. "My parents, they died this past winter. Plague took them, along with many others in the refugee camps." Margaret was silent for a moment, then placed a gentle hand on his arm. "I'm sorry, despite everything. They were your parents." "I've ordered proper burial rites," he said. "They may have been criminals, but they were still human. They deserve that much dignity in death. You continue to show wisdom beyond your years, Your Majesty." He smiled sadly. "I had good teachers, one in particular who showed me that strength can be found in the most unexpected places." As he prepared to leave, William turned back. "The offer stands, you know, to serve as royal advisor. The kingdom would benefit from your wisdom." Margaret shook her head with a gentle smile. "The kingdom is benefiting from my wisdom, Your Majesty. Every child I teach, every person I help to read and write, every small act of service, these ripples spread outward. This is my calling now." Lady Catherine advised kings and shaped policy from above. Sister Margaret teaches children and shapes the future from below. Both are necessary, but I've found my truth in the latter. The king nodded, understanding in his eyes. "Then may you continue your work with my blessing and support. The crown will ensure your school wants for nothing." As the years passed, the kingdom slowly healed. The reforms King William implemented, inspired by Margaret's example and teaching, transformed the realm into something unprecedented, a monarchy that truly served its people rather than exploiting them. The noble families who had survived the trials learned to adapt or found themselves increasingly irrelevant. Margaret aged gracefully, her hair now completely white, her steps slower but still purposeful. She trained other teachers, passing on not just knowledge, but wisdom. Her students went on to become merchants, scribes, healers, and yes, even advisors to the king. They carried with them the lessons she had taught, that true nobility came from service, that power without justice was tyranny, and that even the humblest person could change the world if they had the courage to stand for truth. One winter evening, as snow began to fall outside the cathedral windows, Margaret was organizing texts in the library when she heard footsteps. She turned to find a young woman standing in the doorway, one of her former students, now grown and serving as a magistrate in the royal court. "Sister Margaret," the woman said, "I've been asked to record your story for the royal archives. The king believes future generations should know the truth of what happened, of how one woman's courage changed everything." Margaret considered this, then shook her head slightly. "If you must record something, don't make it about me. Make it about the power of truth over lies, justice over oppression, service over domination. Make it about how ordinary people, when they stand together, can bring down tyrants and raise up leaders. I was merely one thread in a much larger tapestry." "But you were the thread that held it all together," the young woman insisted. "Perhaps," Margaret allowed, "but every thread matters. Every person who stood in that cathedral with a candle, every soul who chose truth over comfortable lies, every child who learns to read and question and think, they all matter. That's the lesson I want preserved." The magistrate nodded, understanding. "Then that's the story I'll tell, the story of how a kingdom found redemption not through the sword or the crown, but through the simple acts of service and courage from those who had been overlooked and oppressed." As the magistrate left to begin her work, Margaret returned to her books, a small smile on her lips. Outside, the snow continued to fall, blanketing the kingdom in white, a clean slate, a new beginning, a promise that even the darkest chapters could give way to brighter ones if people had the courage to turn the page. 10 more years passed. Margaret, now in her 70s, continued her work despite her advancing age. The school she had founded had grown into multiple academies throughout the kingdom. Literary rates soared, and with them, prosperity and justice flourished. The kingdom became known throughout the known world as a place where merit mattered more than birthright, where justice was blind to status, where even the lowest born could rise through education and effort. On what would prove to be one of her last public appearances, Margaret was invited to address the Council of Common Voices on the 20th anniversary of its founding. She stood before them, bent with age but still commanding in her presence, and spoke. 20 years ago, in this very city, I stood in a cathedral and read from a holy book. The words I read spoke of justice, of the mighty being cast down and the humble raised up. Today, I see those words made manifest, not through divine intervention, but through human choice, through your choice to be better than those who came before. But vigilance is eternal. Power still corrupts, and it always will. The temptation to abuse authority, to place personal gain above public good, to silence dissent and ignore suffering, these temptations will never fully disappear. They must be fought in every generation, by every person, in ways both large and small. You ask me sometimes if I forgive those who wronged me. The answer is yes, but forgiveness does not mean forgetting. We must remember the lessons of the past, even as we build the future. We must tell the stories of injustice so that we can recognize it when it tries to return. We must honor the victims by ensuring there are no new ones. I am old now, and my time grows short, but I leave this world with hope because I see in you, in all of you, the guardians of truth and justice that every society needs. You are not perfect, and you will make mistakes. But if you remember that power is a responsibility, not a privilege, that every person has worth, regardless of their station, and that truth must always triumph over convenience, then the kingdom will continue to thrive. She paused, looking out at the assembly. Former students, children of those she had served, representatives of a kingdom transformed. I began my life as Lady Catherine Montrose, advisor to kings, drunk on my own importance. I was humbled, broken, and reborn as Sister Margaret, servant to all, and in that service I found a purpose greater than any I had imagined in my youth. May you all find your own purpose, your own way to serve, your own truth to speak to power. The assembly rose as one, applause thundering through the hall, but Margaret had already turned to go, helped by 2 of her former students. She had said what needed saying. The rest was up to them. Sister Margaret died peacefully in her sleep 3 months later, surrounded by books and papers, midway through preparing a lesson on moral philosophy for her advanced students. Her funeral was unlike anything the kingdom had ever seen. Not because of pomp or ceremony, she had explicitly requested simplicity, but because of who attended. King William stood beside beggars, nobles queued behind merchants, children she had taught to read carried her simple wooden coffin. The cathedral, where she had revealed the truth 2 decades before, was so packed that thousands more stood outside in silent vigil, candles in their hands, just as they had stood that fateful day when truth conquered lies. The Archbishop, now ancient himself, conducted the service. His eulogy was brief but powerful. We gather to mourn Sister Margaret, who was once Lady Catherine, who was always a servant of truth. She showed us that greatness lies not in the power we wield, but in the service we render. She taught us that justice delayed is not justice denied if we have the courage to pursue it. She proved that one person, armed with nothing but truth and conviction, can indeed change the world. But she would not want us to deify her. She would want us to remember that she was human, flawed, capable of both great pride and great humility. Her power came not from perfection, but from the choice to persist, to endure, to serve even when it seemed hopeless. That choice is available to all of us, every day. We honor her best, not with monuments, but with our own choices to speak truth, seek justice, and serve others. As her coffin was lowered into the ground, in the common cemetery, as she had insisted, not in the royal crypt she had been offered, King William stepped forward. In his hands was not a royal decree or golden tribute, but a simple book. It was the same book of sacred prophecies and judgments from which Margaret had read 20 years before. He opened it to the passage she had read that day and spoke in a clear voice. "And in that day the Lord shall restore what was stolen, shall vindicate the falsely accused. Those who bore false witness shall be consumed by their own lies, and justice shall flow like a mighty river." He closed the book and added, "The prophecy was fulfilled, not through divine intervention, but through human courage, through her courage. May we all find such courage when our moment comes." As the crowd dispersed, many noticed something remarkable. The children Margaret had taught over the years had formed a living chain, passing books hand to hand, creating a circle around her grave. Each book was open to a page she had taught from, a lesson she had imparted, a truth she had shared. It was their tribute, not flowers that would wither or gold that would tarnish, but knowledge that would endure, wisdom that would spread, truth that would outlive them all. In the years that followed, the kingdom continued to prosper under King William's wise rule. The reforms Margaret had inspired became so entrenched that they seemed not revolutionary, but simply the way things should be. The Council of Common Voices grew in influence and authority. Education became not just available, but mandatory for all children. Justice became truly blind to status and wealth. Other kingdoms sent emissaries to study what became known as the Margaret Reforms, though she would have laughed at the term. Some adopted similar measures, others resisted, clinging to old ways. But the seed had been planted, the idea released into the world, that power derived from the people, not from divine right or noble blood, and that even the mightiest could fall if they ruled through lies and oppression. The school Margaret had founded became a university, one of the great centers of learning in the known world. Above its entrance, carved in simple letters, were her words, "Truth seeks no crown." Students came from far and wide to study there, to learn not just facts and figures, but the moral philosophy Margaret had embodied, that education without ethics was dangerous, that knowledge without compassion was hollow, that wisdom without service was waste. 100 years later, when historians looked back on the transformation of the kingdom, they would debate Margaret's legacy. Some called her a revolutionary, others a saint. Some focused on her role in bringing down a corrupt monarchy, others on her decades of quiet service, but all agreed on one point. She had proven that change was possible, that truth could triumph over lies, that justice, though delayed, need not be denied forever. In the great cathedral where it all began, a simple plaque was installed. It didn't bear Margaret's name or likeness. She wouldn't have wanted that. Instead, it carried only words, the same words she had spoken to the assembled crowd on that fateful day. "Injustice thrives in silence. The innocent need a voice. True nobility comes from service, from sacrifice, from choosing to stand for what is right, even when it costs everything." Below these words, added by King William himself, was a final line. Here stood Sister Margaret, who was Lady Catherine, who was simply human, and who changed everything by remembering that we all have the power to speak truth to power. The plaque became a place of pilgrimage, not for religious reasons, but for those seeking courage. Students before important examinations, citizens before speaking at council meetings, anyone facing a moment where truth needed speaking would stop there, read those words, and remember that if one woman could stand against a kingdom of lies and prevail, then perhaps they too could find the strength to do what was right. And so Margaret's story became not history, but legacy, not past, but prologue. Every child who learned to read, every citizen who demanded justice, every leader who chose service over self-interest carried forward her example. She had wanted to be forgotten, to have the principles remembered rather than the person. But the kingdom remembered both, understanding finally that the two could not be separated, that principles needed people to embody them, that truth needed voices to speak it, that justice needed hands to enact it. The queen had laughed when the servant opened the holy book. The king had stopped smiling after the second verse, but in the end, it was neither laughter nor fury that mattered. What mattered was that someone had the courage to open the book at all, to read the words that power didn't want heard, to stand in the face of oppression and say simply, clearly, irrevocably, no more. That courage, not noble blood, not divine right, not even education or wisdom, that simple human courage to speak truth in the face of power became the true inheritance of the kingdom. It was Margaret's greatest gift, her lasting legacy, her eternal triumph. She had shown them all that one voice, raised in truth, could echo through eternity. And echo it did, down through the generations, a reminder and a rallying cry, a promise and a warning. Truth seeks no crown, but neither does it bow to one. In the end, truth always wins, not because it is mighty, but because someone, somewhere, will always find the courage to speak it. The story of the servant who opened the holy book became legend, but more than legend, it became inspiration. In taverns and palaces, in schools and churches, in the humble homes of farmers and the grand halls of power, the story was told and retold. Each telling added details, embellishments, interpretations, but the core remained unchanged. One person, armed with truth and courage, had brought down tyranny and raised up justice. Some storytellers focused on the dramatic confrontation in the cathedral. Others dwelt on the 20 years of patient preparation, the slow building of networks and trust among the common people. Still others emphasized the mercy shown at the end, the choice to exile rather than execute, to rebuild rather than simply destroy. But perhaps the most important retellings were the quiet ones. Parents to children at bedtime, teachers to students in humble schoolrooms, friends to friends in moments of doubt or fear. These tellings carried the real lesson Margaret had tried to teach, that every person had the power to choose truth over lies, service over selfishness, courage over comfort. "Remember, Sister Margaret," they would say when someone faced a difficult choice. "Remember how she stood alone in that cathedral, how she spoke truth when all the power in the kingdom wanted her silent. If she could do that, you can do this small thing. You can tell the truth. You can help someone in need. You can stand up to that bully, that corrupt official, that unjust law. You can be the voice for someone who has none." And so Margaret's legacy lived on, not in statues or monuments, but in countless small acts of courage and compassion. Every time someone chose truth over a comfortable lie, every time someone served without thought of reward, every time someone stood up for justice despite the personal cost, Margaret's spirit was there. The kingdom she helped transform became a beacon to the world, proof that change was possible, that the arc of history could indeed bend toward justice, but only when human hands did the bending. Other kingdoms watched and learned, some embracing the changes, others resisting but unable to entirely ignore the example that had been set. As the centuries passed, technology changed, societies evolved, but the fundamental truth Margaret had revealed remained constant. Power without accountability corrupts. Lies may triumph temporarily, but truth endures, and real change comes not from the top down, but from the bottom up. One person at a time, one choice at a time, one act of courage building on another until the impossible becomes inevitable. Her grave in the common cemetery became a garden, tended by generations of students from the school she founded. They planted flowers that bloomed in every season, ensuring that something was always growing, always reaching toward the light. a living reminder that even in the darkest ground, beauty and truth could take root and flourish. And in that garden, children still learned to read, sitting in circles on sunny days, their voices rising and falling with the rhythm of stories and lessons. They learned their letters and numbers, yes, but more than that, they learned what Margaret had always taught, that education was not just about knowledge, but about understanding, not just about personal advancement, but about collective progress, not just about learning to read words, but about learning to read the world and their place in it. The last recorded words of Sister Margaret, found in her journal after her death, became a kind of unofficial motto for the kingdom. I have been both high and low, powerful and powerless, honored and despised. In all these states I was the same person. What changed was not my worth, but others' perception of it. Remember this. Every person you meet has the same intrinsic value, the same capacity for good or evil, the same potential to change the world. Treat them accordingly. Serve them accordingly. Love them accordingly. This is the only true nobility, the only lasting power, the only victory that matters. And so the servant who opened the holy book, who made a queen laugh and a king fall silent, who spent 20 years preparing for a single moment of truth, passed into history and legend, into story and song, into the very fabric of a transformed kingdom. But more than that, she passed into the hearts and minds of countless individuals who understood finally that they too could open the book, speak the truth, change the world. The cathedral bells still ring every year on the anniversary of that day, not in mourning but in celebration, not in ending but in beginning. They ring for truth over lies, for justice over oppression, for service over domination. They ring for Sister Margaret, who was Lady Catherine, who was simply human. But most of all, they ring for everyone who hears them and remembers. The book is always there, waiting to be opened. The truth is always there, waiting to be spoken. The power is always there, waiting to be challenged. All it takes is courage. All it takes is one voice. All it takes is someone willing to stand up, open the book, and read the words that power doesn't want to hear. The Queen laughed when the servant opened the holy book. The king stopped smiling after the second verse. The kingdom was never the same again. And somewhere, in the silence between the bells, in the space between words, in the pause between heartbeats, Sister Margaret's spirit whispers still, your turn, your choice, your moment. The book is open. What will you say? The answer to that question, given not once but countless times, not by one person but by many, not in the past but in the eternal present of moral choice, that answer is her true and lasting legacy. It is the legacy she left not just to a kingdom, but to humanity itself. The knowledge that truth, spoken with courage, can bring down tyranny, that service given with love can transform the world, and that every person, no matter how humble their station, carries within them the power to change everything. The servant opened the holy book. The truth was spoken. The world changed. And it continues to change, one voice at a time, one choice at a time, one act of courage at a time, forever and ever, world without end. This is the story of Sister Margaret. This is the story of Lady Catherine. This is the story of all who choose truth over lies, service over self, courage over comfort. This is your story too, if you choose to claim it. The book is open. The moment is now. What will you say?